All right, welcome to the second event, part of the series, The Agri-Food Industry in the Wake of COVID-19, Countering the Exploitation of Migrant Workers in Italy and the US. The series is jointly organized by the Center for Constitutional Studies and Democratic Development, the CCSDD, in the context of the recently opened chapter on human trafficking and the Bologna Institute for Policy Research, which is based here at Science Europe. But I also want to open by mentioning that this series represents also a SCI's cross-campus initiative, and I want to use this opportunity to send a special thanks to friend and colleague Professor Nina Gardner, who teaches Business and Human Rights at SCI's Washington and who moderated our first webinar of the series, which was devoted to the case of migrant workers in the agri-food industry, and that saw the participation of Judge Laura Safer Espinosa of the Fair Food Standards Council and Ivan Sagnier from NoCap. And if you've missed this event, for those of you that are attending this webinar, please visit the Be Precise website, where you can find both the recording and a written summary. Tonight, specifically, we are focusing on the legal issues that are relevant to the processes of and the policies of legalization of migrant workers in the wake of COVID-19. Of course, we're keeping a special focus on the agri-food industries by comparing policies adopted in Italy and the US. In fact, as we all know, the lockdown measures that have been imposed by governments did nothing but exacerbate pre-existing and long-standing problems. We all know that, for example, in Italy, up to 1/4 of the total agricultural workforce is represented by the migrant workers who suffer different forms of exploitation, while in the US, it is actually an open secret that those harvesting America's food are mainly undocumented immigrants and decades-long residents of the country. Again, tonight we will discuss with our speakers about the different policy options regarding regularization of undocumented agricultural workers in the US and in Italy in the wake of COVID-19. More specifically, we will focus on the Dreamers movement in the USA and the recently passed law number 34, a law passed in 2020 in Italy. Giulia Crescini tonight is with us, and she is a lawyer and a member of the Association for the Juridical Studies on Immigration, which in Italian translates into the acronym ASGI. She deals with the right to international protection, minority rights, the rights of children and women against discrimination and illegal practices. She is also the scientific coordinator of a very interesting project, which is organized in the context of ASGI, if I understand correctly, which is titled two projects, actually. One is called Oruka Project, and the other one is the Shabaka Project, and they regard two different areas, two different groups of African countries. And these projects aim to set up a network of African associations and lawyers with the goal of exposing European and African countries' responsibility for fundamental rights violations that are stemming from asylum and externalization policies. We will share the link to the pages of these projects in the chat, or in the worst case scenario is going to be on the Beeper page right beneath the summary of tonight's seminar. America Hernandez, on her turn, is a Dreamers Movement activist, and she's a senior social services coordinator at KIND. KIND is a leading US national organization advocating for the rights of unaccompanied migrant and refugee children. The Kids in Need of Defense was founded in 2008 by the Microsoft Corporation and UNHCR Special Envoy Angelina Jolie to address the gap in legal services for unaccompanied minors. Through strategic partnerships, KIND provides pro bono legal representation for refugee and migrant children across the United States. And over the past decade, KIND has expanded its services to develop a holistic strategy addressing the needs of these children and the systemic causes of forced migration. KIND's work is impressive. From 2009 to date, more than 20,000 children have been referred to it, and it has trained 50,000 participants on how to represent children who are on their own, and it also fostered over 644 legal partners. Giulia in America will present shortly something about the work they do and about, again, the policy that we just mentioned. In the one case, the Dreamers policy, and the other one, and in the other, the recently passed law, the recently Italian law. But before I pass the floor to them for this intervention, I also want to anticipate that the debate that will follow these short presentations will be moderated by Alexandra Malangone. Now, Alexandra is the recently nominated coordinator of the CCSDD Human Trafficking Chapter. She's one of the leading experts on issues relating to the protection of human rights of victims of trafficking in Italy. From 2008 to 2016, she served as an independent national expert in the Council of Europe, GRETA, the group of experts of action against trafficking in human beings, and was a rapporteur for Denmark, Norway, Italy, Latvia, and Slovenia. Previously to that, she headed the UN Office on Drugs and Crime National Project in Bratislava, in Slovakia, and she currently is a consultant for various international organizations in the field of human rights protection. I am particularly proud to welcome you all. And again, Alexandra is now officially my partner in crime, as we have been working together for over 2 years, and we hopefully will carry on working together in the context of the CCSDD with this new project on human trafficking that I am very, very fond of. And again, thank you to the speakers for joining us. Thank you for those at home listening. I hope this is going to be interesting and useful for everybody. I also want to mention that we are live on the CCSDD Facebook page. Therefore, for those listening on the Facebook page, welcome. I am now going to pass the floor to Alexandra to introduce the two presentations, and then I'm just going to say a few words to conclude the event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for your words and for your introduction. It's an enormous pleasure to be able to be here today with two renowned experts from Italy and from the United States, and to moderate this event. Italy has faced criticism for the working conditions of its migrant workers, with systemic violations of labor legislation, occupational health and safety provisions, trafficking and labor exploitation being normalized in various sectors of Italian economy. Agriculture is one of the sectors where flagrant violations of workers' rights, exploitation and trafficking occur on a major scale. About 1,500 agricultural workers have died in Italy in the past 6 years because of the conditions, according to the Italian NGO Doctors with Africa, QAM. In January, also the UN Special Envoy on the Right to Food condemned Rome as failing to uphold their human rights. And Italian agricultural sector is heavily dependent on about 400,000 seasonal migrant workers, mainly from Eastern Europe and North Africa, who make up 36% of the seasonal legal workforce. But this year, because of travel restrictions owing to the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a shortfall of around 250,000 workers, according to Coldiretti, which is Italy's biggest agricultural association. The gap could have been filled by the estimated 200,000 undocumented farm workers, mainly from sub-Saharan Africa, as Ivan Sagnet told us during our previous event. Has it? The new regularization law was initially created as a major step forward for workers' rights and as an example of good migration policy during the coronavirus pandemic. It is actually not the first time Italy has offered a path towards temporary regularization. Over the past 35 years, there have been 9 regularization attempts. So I would ask Giulia to open tonight's event and to search answers together with us to the question, has the new regularization law been a major step forward for workers' rights in your view? Was it the new law's aim? What was the new law's aim? And who was it meant to regularize and how? Giulia, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Alexandra, and good evening to everybody. We can start saying that in May 2020, a new regularization was introduced. Regularization, we can say that is an extraordinary legislative intervention with a dual aim. From one side, the new law wants to bring black work to light, and from another side, it wants to give a residence permit to irregular workers. As is well known in Italy, but also in many other countries around the world, the residence permit always precedes the job. In other words, it is necessary to have a residence permit to be able to work regularly. On the contrary, having a job is not sufficient to have a residence permit. These extraordinary measures reverse this approach. It is sufficient to have a job in order to have a residence permit. In all other cases, a residence permit can be obtained according to the ordinary or extraordinary procedure. The ordinary procedure requires that one can enter Italy with a job offer and with an employer ready to offer a work contract, according to the so-called flussi in Italian. Over the years, however, the so-called flows have become less and less relevant from a numerical point of view. And therefore, the easiest way to obtain a residence permit is through the extraordinary channel. Regularization under the extraordinary channels means regularizing oneself by applying for asylum, for example, and obtaining humanitarian protection or international protection, or through family law, having a spouse or children in Italy who are regular. The survival of this system was linked to the fact that many asylum seekers were able to obtain humanitarian protection because of the enormous violence and trauma they had suffered in Libya. The residence permit for humanitarian reasons was renewable or convertible into work. However, with the Salvini decree law at the end of 2018, this residence permit is repealed. Many people failed to convert it, and many asylum seekers failed to get another form of protection. Therefore, in addition to COVID, it must be said that the regularization was necessary because, on the one hand, the legislator prevented or interrupted regularization according to the extraordinary channel. And on the other hand, the entry from abroad of those who wanted to work in Italy was not facilitated. Any regularization is obviously a fundamental step in respecting the rights of foreign citizens. Indeed, the residence permit makes it possible to re-establish that position of legal equality between individuals. A foreign citizen without a residence permit has less chance of exercising and demanding respect for his rights. For example, a person without residence permit will not able to go to the police to lodge a complaint because otherwise he could be deported. In principle, therefore, there is no doubt that the final objective of this law is worthy of consideration. However, is the approach of this regularization that leaves one skeptical about the real wishes of the legislator. Let me give you an example. It is possible to regularize only those who work in three sectors: agriculture, domestic helpers, and carers. One wonders why, why it is not possible to regularize other undeclared workers, especially, for example, in catering or transport sector. Furthermore, the request for immersion from regular employment is submitted by the employers, who receives all the communication, and there is no instrument to protect the workers if the employer does not want to continue with this practice. Finally, if the aim was really protection, why not extend this extraordinary intervention to a systematic policy of regularization of all those who have an existing employment relationship? Once again, we ask ourselves whether this regularization is not a cosmetic intervention compared to a much greater need for regularization. Consider, and I will conclude here, that regularization and the residence permit is something that primarily serves foreign workers, who can then demand fair wage, acceptable working hours, and social and welfare guarantees. This law does not seem to have fully addressed this need.
Giulia, thank you. So, in your views, what should such long-term solutions look like in order not to postpone only the bigger problem of a long-term solution, of a systemic solution, so to say?
We can say that the new law, as we said before, has no real and lasting effect on the need of regularization. It concerned the too small part of the population, and the requirements were too numerous. There are many alternative proposals that could be made. One of these, which was introduced with the new Lamorgese Decree Law 130 of 2020, is the convertibility of most residence permits, so that once a residence permission has been obtained, it is very difficult to lose it. Let me explain. Many people manage to obtain a first residence permit for very different reasons: humanitarian reason, family reason, presence of illness, dependent children, etc. Once the period of validity of this permit has expired, which is usually 1 year, it is necessary to allow the conversion of these permits into work permits. So when you find employment, you can obtain a residence permit for work reason. Another way is to reintroduce the residence permit for humanitarian reason. With Decree 130, special protection is reintroduced, which allow many foreign citizens, including those from Libya, to be granted a first residence permission. This permit lasts 2 years and can be converted into work. This creates a situation of continuous regularity. Another fundamental intervention would be to liberalize entry and exit. In this way, people can arrive in Italy by plane, look for work, and if they don't find one, they could go back. We should introduce visas for job seeking so that people are free to move around, try to improve their situation, and if they don't go back to and if they want, they can go back to their country of origin. On the contrary, if you face very dangerous journeys and Europe is not what you expected, you cannot go back and you will remain without exit strategy in a very fragile condition. I think, Alexandra, your microphone is mute.
I'm sorry, I'm back. And thank you very much, Giulia. I now give the floor to America to tell us about herself and her story.
Well, thank you, Giulia and Alexandra and everybody for inviting me to be on here. It is definitely fascinating to hear about the differences in immigration policies and just aspirations of people who are immigrants in different parts of the world and compare my story. I myself am a senior social services coordinator with Kids in Need Defense, or KIND, as Sarah explained. And although in my professional role, my job is to work with unaccompanied immigrant children and make sure that they are connected to proper social services to work in a holistic way to address their legal needs and just in general their needs. Today I'm here talking at a more personal level about my personal experience as a dreamer in the United States, as an undocumented person in the United States, as somebody who lives in the agricultural center of the United States, which is the Central Valley in California. And as this pandemic has taken off, we've definitely seen the disparities affect our communities, our immigrant communities, our farm worker communities in much higher rates than in other communities. So immigrants here in California are essential, especially those in the agricultural and service sectors. They're still out there cleaning, they're still out there working in the restaurants, they're still out there picking our food. The food from the Central Valley is being exported to all parts of the world. So it is considered one of the fruit baskets of the world. And so I see this firsthand, and as I hear Giulia speak, it definitely resonates with me because it is the experience shared by many immigrants throughout, I think, the world, those that are wanting to belong, wanting to exist. And at the same time, you know, we see a lot of policies that need to be enacted to protect not just the employers and the country, but also the worker themselves, for human reasons, for human rights. So thank you for having me. I'm America Hernandez. I am an immigrant from Mexico. I arrived to the United States when I was 3 months old. I have lived all of my life as an undocumented immigrant. However, in 2012, President Obama announced the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals in the United States. And I was very fortunate to be able to qualify for that program and to be able to benefit from it. I did apply within the first months of it being announced. And since the program was implemented, I have been fortunate to be able to get a work permit. And with that work permit came a lot of different protections: protection from deportation, protection from police. You know, you're always, as an immigrant, especially an undocumented immigrant, you're always watching your back. You're always living in fear. And a program like Daca has really helped, you know, because it gives us the opportunity to be able to legally work. You can now accept jobs. For example, here as a dreamer, I grew up in the United States. I lived all of my life, and in many ways, I am as American as anybody else. However, I had the limitation of not having a document to allow me to live freely and to be able to exercise a lot of the same rights that people are able to exercise. For example, being able to go to college and get the same opportunities in terms of financial, having financial aid or access to college, having protection from deportation, feeling scared to be outed. So when I was in college, when I was 16, I began working with immigrants' rights to advocate for persons like myself. With Daca now, it gives us a very different experience. Now, I am now 37 years old, and in my program, my master's program for social work. And that's something that without Daca, I might not ever have been able to do, because I still can't apply for many of the loans. I still don't qualify for a lot of financial assistance. So with Daca, there was a lot more attention that came to this group, and there's still not a lot of financial assistance through the government. However, a lot of the public has stepped up to really help individuals like myself. I've also been able to now use my professional degree in a more professional setting. So now I can have a job as a senior social services coordinator with an international organization, which was a dream of mine when I was younger. However, before Daca, I worked for 15 years or so in the restaurant industry because I was not able to legally work in my professional title or degree, whatever my aspirations were. So Daca has been very significant. Again, it was a program that has a lot of benefits, but it's not a program that is permanent. So since Trump was elected in 2017, one of his first goals, even during his campaign, was that he would end Daca, because he said he was going to force there to be a permanent legislation for dreamers. However, he ended the program and nothing ever really happened. And so since 2017, there has been a dwindling down of the program. First-time applicants were no longer able to apply. So a lot of people that would have qualified for Daca were no longer able to apply. Then from there, there were a lot of federal injunctions. And so through different courts, they allowed the program to continue over the last 4 years, but it's been extremely traumatic and difficult for a lot of us in this situation, because every few months you're wondering, am I going to be out of work? Am I going to lose everything I've worked for? And it's been really difficult. So eventually all of the federal injunctions ended up in the Supreme Court, who heard the arguments about the program being ended without following proper protocols and procedures. No one has really ever disputed that Trump didn't have the right to end the program because it was an executive action, something that the president before him had enacted and the next president could remove. However, the way he did it did not follow procedure. And the Supreme Court earlier this year in June did rule that Trump ended the program without following the proper procedures. And if he wanted to end the program, he would then have to go back and do it the right way. The Supreme Court also ordered that Daca be reinstated to its original form as it was in 2012, which would allow for first-time applicants to be able to apply, and also for current Daca recipients to be able to apply for advanced parole or being able to leave the country for humanitarian reasons, for school purposes, or for work purposes. However, the acting secretary of the Department of Homeland Security here in the United States decided to not follow that ruling. And in fact, he actually cut back protections even more in the last few months for DACA recipients. And he cut the work permits of people who had DACA from 2 years to 1 year, and very much limited the ability to apply for advanced parole. So there was another lawsuit that followed after that. And a federal court in New York recently ruled about 2 weeks ago that the acting director of Department of Homeland Security did not have the authority to dwindle down or to further limit DACA, and that he had to restore DACA. So as of last week, we had another ruling that said DACA had to be fully restored. Now, for the first time in almost 4 years, we're going to be seeing first-time applicants have to apply again. And we see some of the challenges that will come up with that, because now there's so many years that you have to prove continuous residency. You have to prove that you were here every single month since 2007 or so. And so it is a heavy burden on a lot of these young people who will have to prove that. It's expensive for a lot of people who, as we're going through a pandemic, are working in fields. However, the benefits are great. And so we are very hopeful and encouraging of those who can apply for the first time to go ahead and do so.
America, thank you very much. So DACA recipients currently make up a huge part of US workforce. Through some available statistics, there are more than 3,000 registered nurses, 5,000 nursing and home health aides, about 4,000 medical assistants of these professions, among other field workers. Then we have Migration Policy Institute data, which says 23% of DACA recipients are working in accommodation for food services industry. 40% are in 14.14 are in retail trade. 11% are in construction. 11% are in educational, health, and social services. 10% are in professional, scientific management, administrative, waste management jobs. So these are huge portions of the US workforce who are actually Daca. What does the landmark Supreme Court ruling delivered during the pandemic bring for dreamers who are considered essential workers, but with particular focus on agriculture? You yourself are a daughter of farm workers, and there may be about 2.4 million farm workers in the US. Between 50% and 70% of them are undocumented. Other surveys show that a large majority of them, over 80%, have resided in the US for at least 5 years. A substantial portion are parents of children who are US citizens or lawful permanent residents, right? You also have a similar program called DAPA, Deferred Action for Parental Accountability, and it allows eligible parents to apply for temporary relief from deportation and work authorization. So there are some rough estimates here. I don't know if I have the correct number, which say that a rough estimate of farm workers eligible for DAPA is 450,000. So could you maybe tell us a little bit more about DAPA immigration relief in connection to Daca and whether it fulfills its aim in improving protection of migrant workers' rights and tackling systemic exploitation and violation of labor laws, particularly in agriculture, in your view?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So there was a couple of questions in that, but I will go back to for essential workers who are currently DACA recipients, being able to have DACA fully restored, what the Supreme Court decision did for us, and now this final ruling by the federal court in New York that fully restores DACA, is that it brings you a sense of peace and stability that you can't really have when everything is up in the air. I mean, with the pandemic, for those who are essential workers, especially if they're in the medical field or maybe even the agricultural sector, it's difficult for you to be able to think about all of those challenges as you're also facing your own personal challenges. These are very stressful times economically, mentally, with family being affected personally. There's so much going on with the pandemic that having this peace of mind that now you can feel protected under this program, especially because now we're transitioning into a new administration who has promised to continue with DACA being fully restored until there's some form of formal legalization or a pathway to citizenship. So it brings a lot more stability for us to be able to go forward and continue doing the essential work that the United States and all parts of the world really need. As to the point about DAPA, so yes, DAPA is a very similar, it's an executive action as DACA, and it was announced in 2014 by President Obama. What DAPA would have done is that it would have given protection to the parents of American citizens and legal permanent residents in the same way as DACA did, where you would have a work permit and protection from deportation. And what that does for many families is give them that stability that they really truly need. DAPA would, although it was fully rescinded by Trump, would have helped many of these families through this time right now, as essential workers. As you have rightfully stated, many of the farm workers would probably consider for DAPA. They would qualify for DAPA. DAPA would have protected a lot of these essential workers had we known that there was going to be a pandemic. Right now, they wouldn't be worried about losing their housing, about losing their jobs. With the pandemic, there has been a lot of indirect effects on farm workers, even though they're greatly needed. The fact that they had to cut back some of the labor forces, for example, you can't have too many people in one room. You're getting people that are sick because they're in close proximity. They don't have access to medical doctors because they don't have medical insurance. So there's a lot of problems. There's also the problem of housing when you have to share housing with 2 or 3 families and there's 10 to 15 people per home. You know, you are in more closer proximity to people who could be getting sick. And as people are getting sick, we're losing some of our workforce, and they don't have the resources because and even the protections, the stimulus packages that were passed in the United States to help people who are being economically affected, immigrant workers, especially those like those would-be qualified DAPA recipients that are working in the fields, they didn't qualify for some of these stimulus packages. And so they have to continue working at the same levels that they were working prior to the pandemic. They can't stop because there won't be there is no safety net for them. So they have to continue working. DAPA is something that is long overdue. It's something that should have been done a long time ago. DAPA, it had estimated back there even before the pandemic and before Trump, that it would have had a huge economic benefit for the United States. We would have seen, some studies would say, an 88 million increase in all incomes for all Americans if they had passed DAPA. There would have been over 20,000 jobs per year being created by these DAPA recipients. And in fact, there would have been a increase in payroll taxes of over 16 billion in 5 years. So the economic benefits of a law like DAPA are huge for the country. On top of that, to address some of the issues of just human rights, you know, being able to have protection will mean that you are able to feel safe in reporting crimes. You feel safe if you need to report labor abuses. It reduces the amount of people who are being labor trafficked. There's a lot of benefits on the social side, on the social services side, that would have come from it. Oftentimes people think that undocumented immigrants are leeching off the system and they're taking from the country, when in fact we are contributing billions to the economy, but this money is not coming back to the communities that it's not coming back to the immigrant communities as much, you know. So we continue to see the disparities growing when you have people who are living in horrible conditions in a country that should be providing better for its citizens, but it's benefiting from the money that these people are creating. It's just not giving back. And so those are some of the things that we see that are exploitation and human rights abuses that we could help mediate if we really wanted to through legislation like DAPA, or hopefully more permanent legislation that would not be easily removed by an administration that, you know, didn't favor it or didn't want it, or who wanted to continue abusing the fact that you get very cheap labor from immigrants.
America, thank you. Many organizations and coalitions, also, for example, Immokalee Workers or Farm Worker Justice, in cooperation then with unions and others, are helping to ensure that farm workers and their children are actually able to advantage the opportunity to earn DACA. Farm workers face, of course, special obstacles throughout your huge country due to their geographical isolation, low wages. So in a similar fashion as the question that was initially posed to Giulia on systemic solutions and what could be the systemic solutions on a large long-term base, will DACA, in your view, solve the large-scale problems in agriculture and other sectors where the majority of undocumented migrant workers are unable to to improve their working conditions? You mentioned that human rights perspective. Is this something that has the potential to solve the large-scale problems of this sector, or at least to help to alleviate them?
Yeah, and thank you for that question again. I think that's an important one as well. You know, is DACA alone able to help? Yes and no. You know, I think that DACA has already had a positive impact on the agricultural economy in the United States. For example, the Bureau of Economic Analysis in 2016 reported that just in 2016 alone, there was an increase of $2 billion to the US GDP in the agricultural sector alone because of DACA recipients. So that shows that even though only about 14% DACA recipients are in the agricultural sector, and they've had that large of a contribution to the GDP in that sector. We can see that in other sectors, there's probably been a lot more economic contribution. So just in the agricultural sector, DACA has already had a large improvement, and DAPA has the potential. However, I do believe that we have to go beyond DACA. That's just the first step. And although, like I said, when you have DACA, you feel that protection, and you are able to now report crimes. You're able to feel more protected. You're able to secure housing, you know, and medical insurance and everything else without feeling like you could be deported. That will help to stimulate the economy that we are currently in. With this pandemic, we can see that the economy will be shattered. It is already being shattered. Thousands of people are losing their homes, they're losing their businesses, I mean their jobs. It's had huge economic impacts on our communities. And so the being able to legalize undocumented workers through not just DACA, but through permanent immigration reform, like we saw in 1986 with the IRCA. We have seen that IRCA, when it legalized many of the farm workers, it had huge significant contributions to the economy and also to the communities. Those communities were some of the communities that, you know, integrated faster than many other communities. They were able to become citizens within 10 years. They have bought many homes. They invested back into their communities. It showed that prior to 1986 or the IRCA program, a lot of families were actually sending back money to Mexico with the thought that they would have to one day return. However, after they were legalized, they were able to invest that money back into the community that they were living in, because then they were able to also just plan on being there, bring their families through family-based petitions. And a lot of those protections have greatly contributed to our local communities. So we see that through that program, we already have a taste of what permanent legislation could do for the country and for the communities and for the citizens who are living in those communities. So I do believe that DACA are a great first step that can help in the near future, and that can be done in a much faster way. However, the goal should always be permanent protections with the goal of one day being able to obtain permanent citizenship in the country.
Thank you very much, America. I will go back now to Giulia to uncover an extra layer of you know, administrative technical obstacles to regularization. Giulia, so to file an application under the new regularization law, the fee, there's a certain fee, right? The fee, if I'm correct, is around 500 euros. Is this correct, Giulia? So this is one aspect. The second aspect is, as you said, that of course all the communication in terms of the submission of your application is with the employer. Do you see these two factors as potentially obstacles to actually even the start of the process of filing an application for regularization under the current Italian law?
Thanks, Alessandra, for your question. I think that there are a lot of elements that can obstacle or make it difficult, the request of regularization. Not only the two that you mentioned, but for example, it should be noted that only workers whose employers submit requests for regularization between 15 of June and 15 of August 2020 can be regularized. All subsequent requests are not valid. Then it's not it's possible to regularize only if you work in agriculture as domestic helper or as a carer. In these cases, if you make it through to the end of the procedure, the worker will be able to obtain a 1-year renewable working residence permit. In addition, the employer must have specific characteristics, including having an annual income of at least 20,000 euros. the entire focus of the proceeding is on the employer, who applies for immersion and accompanies the worker throughout the procedure. If the employer drops out, what happens to the worker? The legislator forgot to provide for the issuing for a residence permit for awaiting employment. In addition, there is also another possibility of immersion provided by the Article 103. According to this case, a foreign citizen who has a residence permit that expires after 31st October 2019 can apply for a temporary residence if he has worked in the past in one of these three sectors. We really do not understand this limitation to only certain work sectors. Having legal citizen working regularly is good for the whole community, as they pay taxes. If they are injured, they have health and welfare coverage. If you are pregnant, you can receive a salary. Everything leads to the conclusion that there is no underlying reason not to regularize all foreign citizens. This law really is not helping with the fact these people to regularize this position. There are too many requirements, too many obstacles to asking and obtain regularization. In this moment, all these foreign citizen is waiting the appointment in prefectura, but actually very few employment still wants to go on with the proceeding because they have already paid. From their opinion, the proceeding is concluded. But actually, a lot of people has not already obtained the residence permission.
Thank you, Giulia. No, absolutely. And, you know, in the context of now specific context of trafficking, right? A very much criticized increase of dependency on one employer in terms of, you know, if your working permit is tied to employer, which has a direct effect on then your residence permit in the situations of violations of your human rights, exploitation, abuse, trafficking. And we may not go all the way to the level of an extreme exploitative conditions. It's enough if we are already talking about occupational health, safety, labor code violations, etc., that may amount, you know, still if other elements of trafficking definition are fulfilled. But the increasing of the dependency on your employer seems to be absolutely there, even under the current regularization attempt. Is it so? And another aspect that I'm thinking of is the fact of the fee. Often, I believe this would be detracted from the worker's salary in the future. At least in my experience, this is very likely to take place. What do you think?
Regarding your second point, of course, Alexandra, it's not correct to say it, but we know that in almost all cases, the workers pay the fee, but actually the fee should be paid by the employer, because it's a like of sanatory for the black work that his worker has already done for him. So these 500 euros is actually a fine that the employer needs to pay to Italian government, because after this regularization, not only the worker can obtain a residence permission, but also the employer can obtain like a depenalization for his crime, because when you have on your dependency a worker without residence permission, you commit a crime. So after regularization, also your position is clear, and you have to pay this fine of 500 euros to Italian government just to clear your position, like if we want to say it in an easy way. For what regard your first question, we have already seen in the past a lot of cases in which the strict relationship between the employer and the worker can like can stress situation that on the contrary should be addressed by the government. We saw the case of people coming from East Europe and employed as dancer, for example, and who were linked to their employer, and they could not change job or work because their residence permission was linked to the employer who bring them to Italy. So our attention should be focused on break this link between employer and the worker. What we need to have is a residence permission to everybody, but residence permission just linked to the work capacity or the humanitarian reason or whatsoever, but just linked to the person, not to the worker or to the employer or to other person that can exploit this situation of fragility. Because as we said before, just a residence permission can give to foreign citizen a position of equality, because they can go to the police, they can go to the hospital, they can ask for the respect of their rights. Otherwise, how can they do? They fear to be deported. We know that if you go to the police and you try to lodge a complaint, they say, okay, at first you lodge a complaint, you sign the paper, and then I give you an expulsion order. This is what is happening at the moment in Italy.
Thank you very much, Giulia, for absolutely enlightening explanation. And we receive finally some questions and to our forum. So I will take some from there. There's one question that I pose it, and then you both maybe can answer. How would you recommend students wanting to research the situation of these farmers during COVID-19 go about carrying out this research, especially when traveling might not be available and local organizations are stressed fighting for public health rights for these farmers? Who would like to answer first, America or Giulia?
Maybe America.
I'll take that. I have actually had students reach out, and you're correct, it's hard right now, right? Because organizations are responding rather than being able to take a step back and really analyzing the situation. You're often in this like survival mode right now, where everybody's just wanting to put out the next fire. So it's really hard to think back, but I know that there are a lot of like local universities that are doing this research and reaching out to some of those universities, like UCSF, I think has had some projects like that. And don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure that they have. And then there's other local agencies like the public health departments who are also really taking a look at how are these pandemics, what are the consequences that are occurring for some of these farm workers. There's been a lot of emphasis on technology too, the technological disparities in agricultural sectors, because it's largely rural communities, and how are kids being impacted by the education gap, without being able to access education properly because of lack of Wi-Fi, or even not having the support at home because their parents are busy working all day long. Farm workers face some significant challenges when it comes to education for their kids right now during a pandemic. But I would say that finding those local public health departments, seeing if you can connect to some of those nonprofit organizations that are on the ground by maybe sending shorter, more intentional surveys to get some more responses, seeing if you can partner with local people on the ground who are maybe more connected and have those personal relationships, and it would be easier for them to be able to reach out to someone and say, hey, I would love this information from you, and there's already that personal rapport. So that would just be some suggestions, but I agree right now organizations are on survival mode, so it's really hard for extra work when it comes in, but linking up with other providers that are on the ground, I think, is the best suggestion.
Another question, looking at a lot of farm worker projects, many times this data is not disaggregated by gender. What are your thoughts about this, Giulia, and maybe then America also? What effects had this had on women farm workers in particular?
Of course, if you don't have these disaggregated data, you cannot address a specific intervention to women. We can say that the needs of women farm workers are very different from men farm workers. Maybe it's one of the sector in which this difference is most stressed. And in this way, also the legislation can be not effective, because if you don't know which is the target of your legislative intervention, maybe you cannot underline the specific best intervention to address the problem. And we can also say that the work of farm workers maybe is seasonal, and in Italy, as you know, this situation is stressed because of the different culture in and the different work in the specific area of the country. So I think that the lack of this data can have very big consequences in the legislative and administrative intervention of the authorities.
America, what do you think on your part?
One thing I would add to that, and I agree with Giulia, but some things that I don't have the data in front of me because I didn't research this topic before coming on, but I have been in various conferences here with farm workers where we've seen that women, especially in situations like where they feel that because they're undocumented, they don't have a lot of ways of protecting themselves. They've faced a lot of sexual violence and assault in fields and by farmers, maybe not the farmer themselves, but there's the contractors that work. And so women have faced a lot of sexual assault, and they're afraid of reporting it for fear of losing their jobs, or for fear of losing or being deported or getting into any kind of trouble. And so those are some of the consequences that we do see. But I again, don't know how much research there is on that. I agree that there has to be a difference. It has to be further explored how gender plays an issue in this work, because on top of that, women also, especially thinking culturally, all of the different responsibilities that women have in the households. You know, as Latinas, for example, here in the United States, you know, a woman is in charge of the rearing of the children, of making sure that the food is cooked, that the house is clean, and on top of that, you're working and you're competing with men often for jobs that are more known to be suitable for men. But at the same time, you have to put food on the table for your children. So I would love to see more exploration of how gender plays an issue. But again, I would come back to, one is for the protection of women as well, because I do know from hearing firsthand accounts that these abuses happen in workplaces and women are afraid of reporting.
Thank you very much, America, for pointing out to this. And you actually, you know, took the words from me, because I was exactly, you know, if you were not going to address that, I was going to raise it later. Again, specifically when talking about the discourse linked to the trafficking for labor exploitation, I myself oppose a lot of the strict division between trafficking, when we say trafficking for labor exploitation, as if we assumed that actually sexual exploitation cannot be linked to that labor exploitation, specifically when we talk about women in agriculture. And an excellent case study is really served to us on a silver plate, and that is you know, Andalusia, Huelva region in the south of Spain, where you have bilateral agreement between the Spanish government and the Moroccan government to bring Moroccan mothers of young children at maximum up to the age of 30 as strawberry pickers or workers in the agriculture, where sexual exploitation is rampant. Yet so many women apply for this scheme from areas of Morocco where they really are the only breadwinners, but one of the eligibility conditions is that you have to have children below 18 years of age. Otherwise, you can't participate in the program. And now many women got blocked due to pandemic without being able to work in the field and without being able to return home to their families in Morocco for the next season. The numbers have been cut, yet a huge interest in for this income generation activity. So are we fostering further violations of human rights, even through legal bilateral schemes to, you know, in agriculture and, you know, in other sectors? It's very well known that, you know, women from some countries in Italy who work in agriculture, you know, prefer maybe that younger women don't go to those positions because they know that they would be sexually assaulted and they may not be able, you know, to find a partner, etc. So this is something that I'm, you know, very grateful that you have raised, because I think we have to stop making these types of artificial divisions and saying it's either this or that. Things are much more complex than this kind of black and white vision. But there's one more question that I would like to address, for example, to you, to Giulia, and it says, what are some of the abuses that you find while working in ASGI, while doing your work in terms of abuse of human rights of agricultural workers, but also workers in other sectors that you face on an everyday basis?
We can say that we see a lot of abuses, but not only regarding women, but also men. We face sexual abuses, and not only in agriculture, but also in inside houses. And for us, working as kolf or carers is not a synonymous of protection. On the contrary, a lot of people who work in houses have less protection because they live in the same house for all the time without any free day with the employer, and the employer can control the life of these people. In this period, we are meeting a lot of these workers, and we try to see which is the legislative instrument to help them to break the link with the employer and give them independency through a residence permit. Actually, we in Italy, we have some residence permission that can be asked by a person who suffer abuses or exploitation, not all in the country of origin, but specifically in Italy. So we have people who have suffered worker exploitation or sexual exploitation in Italy and can ask for a specific residence permit. The problem is not to gain or to obtain this residence permission, but again, to ask this residence permission, because people don't go to the police asking for a residence permission. It's impossible that they know that they have the right to ask it. But even if they know they have the right, they can't go to the police asking it. So I think that in Italy, we have the instrument to address the exploitation, both sexual exploitation and work exploitation. That is the two most important field of work we have. But then the most important thing is to structure a legal defense, a social structure in order to help people to be protected at first, and then to go to the police asking for residence permission. So I think this is very complex. Is the proceeding included the identification of abuses, and then to put the person in safe, maybe in a house where he or she has no connection with the employer or another person, and then help them to go and ask for residence permission, because we have the instrument to give the people free from the abuser, but actually it's very difficult to activate this instrument.
Mm. Thank you, Giulia. There is a particular question for America. You have already in part answered, but I read the question. Do you know the percentage of women migrant workers in the agriculture sector in the US? And do you think they should have special protections? I'm thinking of the person who asked the question, Nina Gardner. I say hello. I'm thinking of gender-based violence in the fields and their fear for child dependence. Maybe we could concentrate on this aspect of the fear for child dependence, because you had already mentioned the gender-based violence in the fields. Ideally, how can the US government support them more, and has COVID exposed more needs?
Yeah, so I think that we have something in the United States called a U visa, which is a visa for victims of crimes that grants some protections. There's also what we have a T visa, trafficking visa, where if you have been trafficked for labor or for sex work or for any of that, you can apply for these protections in the United States. However, in order for you to qualify, sometimes that requires you to report your abuser, which we know, and I don't have the specific number of, instances or not, but we know that often for women who are in abusive situations, or where this kind of trauma occurs, it's difficult to report, because as we're talking about, how does it affect my livelihood, how does it affect my children, how does it affect my status, will I get deported? So a lot of people are not aware of legal protections that are already in place to protect them, so they don't report. And so we have that issue, but we do have what we call a U visa. So it is for somebody who has been a victim of a crime, who reports the crime and who cooperates with authorities. And then the authorities will sign off that the person did cooperate. So any police department, or even the labor department, or even the child protection department, they can sign off for this visa. And that has given an extra element of protection for some of these people, or women who have been in those situations. However, not a lot of people know about it. So it's something, and another thing that happened is that there's been so many crimes against victims, and the logs for protections, the wait times to be able to actually obtain a U visa or a T visa are years. And so it's not an immediate protection necessarily, in terms of immigration. It is something that will be great once you get it, but right now U visas, for example, can take up to 7 years, which is a really long time to wait for that protection. So yeah, I don't know the exact number of women that are in the fields. I don't have that statistic with me. However, there are a large number of women, and the way that the agricultural sector here is broken up is that we have packing houses where women might be more prominent there, or there might be specific types of labor that would be more suited for women, quote unquote. There's women in all sectors, but I think that it definitely depends on the kind of crop and what specific job they're doing that we see it at. But I think sexual abuse continues to be very rampant despite some of the protections we have in place, but it does help to have those protections. So I would encourage places like Italy to look into that. How do you hold those employers accountable when there are abuses? Or is there protections for the workers, and maybe that's something that can continue to be taken up with the government, as you guys are talking about these visas or residency for people who are foreigners in those countries, is how do you take away some of that power from those employers, so that there is more reporting of these instances. And the United States, like I said, has attempted, but I can't tell you I have statistics on how successful, although I have personally seen that a lot of people are now moving more towards the U visa. A lot of people still don't know about the trafficking visa, but the U visa has become a very popular type of protection here.
America, thank you. I think we've got time for 2 more questions. So there's one question still in the questions and answers section. And then I would like to also ask Sarah if she still has one more question, which we can take before we close. And this one's again for you, America. And yeah, it's an interesting question. So I'll read it for you. Why should countries like the US, with a very secure food system, care to provide extra protection for their farm workers, particularly women? I agree they should provide extra, but I'm wondering how you would pitch for this to be a policy priority, given that a system like the US is quite secure in terms of food.
Yeah, that's a big one. But I think that, so here's a little bit of a controversial thing, but it's not so unknown, right? Immigration has sort of been tailored to be able to be an economic benefit, right? If we keep a working class in a certain place where they can't really revolt too much, and they continue to accept lower wages or poor working conditions, then you can continue to keep people there and benefit from that labor. You know, farmers are able to, we have some of the richest people in this area, and yet you go to all of these little towns and you see some of the worst poverty in the United States. And so you see that disparity, right? I would argue that it is in the best interest of the United States to help the immigrant workforce, because it has shown time and time again that immigrants are very capable of boosting the economy, of continuing to stimulate the economy. They're having more children that can contribute to Social Security. There's more, with added benefits and protections, they would invest more into the community. I can speak broadly about Latinos because I think it's the largest population of immigrants that we have in the United States, primarily Mexicans, who I happen to be a Mexican immigrant, you know, but out of the 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States, a large percentage of those are Mexicans who have been here for over a decade. And that's been something that we've seen. So right now, what keeps a lot of these immigrants from being able to purchase homes, from being able to open businesses, is just not having access to that legal, the Social Security, to a work permit, to whatever. So I would argue that opening that door would actually add to the country, and it would contribute in many ways in terms of the economic sector. I would also say that on the social services side, you know, immigrants make a lot of jobs. Like they here in the United States, it's among one of the groups that have created the majority of the small businesses. So we see that immigrants have a positive impact on the economy. With that, that would create jobs for many other Americans, for many other people. There's this special grit that exists in immigrant communities because you're always needing to persevere. You're always needing to keep moving forward. And that grit is a very American value that I think that would really benefit the American country in general if we continue to have that contribution from immigrant groups who keep bringing this grit forward. So I would say that in more ways than one, even just in integration and in enriching the nation in so many ways, being able to add this group to fully integrate into the United States and to contribute fully economically and socially to the country would bring a lot of wealth to the nation. Something that I think we're losing over the years, because although America is established, I think that right now we can see that there is definitely a lot of tension. There's a lot of, it's in this place of like growth of what happens now, right? We're seeing that Latinos, for example, in California have already become the majority. So what happens if we don't integrate these groups? You know, you're disenfranchising a big percentage of your communities, and that's not going to help the overall growth of America. You need to have those communities come together to reduce their divisiveness and to really like incorporate that into the fabric of what America was meant to be.
Thank you, America. There is a actually comment also to this question and to your intervention from one of the participants, saying 1 of 9 people in the US are food insecure. There is a difference between hunger and food security. Access to nutrition food is a problem, either because there are food deserts or due to cost. Also a small comment on the obstacles to U visa, for example, right? It's linked to obstacles to identification discourse, even when we talk about trafficking or any other lens through which we tend to view things. So is that the local enforcement agency must certify the report of the crime. So you have to go and report the crime. We have had situations where the local sheriff or police chief will not certify situations of domestic violence or abuse because they believe these are family matters. So this is again, a question of culture, of awareness, of the lens through which see things. It's, if you don't report the crime, are you still a witness of the crime, and specifically, trafficking crime, abuse crime, domestic violence crime, what are the obstacles? And it's a lot of awareness raising work needs to be done in this area as well. And then there's also another comment that we receive. America, you have absolutely captured the experiences of many North American immigrants. I especially resonate with the entrepreneurial points that you have mentioned. So, Sara, I hand over to you for any additional questions and for the closure of today's webinar.
Well, before we close, I have a very short question for the both of you. Listening to you both, I confirmed an idea that I already have, that both legal systems actually provide for numerous tools to protect people that can be qualified as undocumented workers in different market areas. So let's not focus exclusively on the agri-food industry, but somehow accessing these tools of protection seems difficult for a whole series of reasons. Now, there might be loopholes, as we all know, in the Italian legislation, for example. But I was wondering, do you think that investing more on training those that are involved, both on the legal side, on the social side, and maybe in civil society at large, training more people, security forces, for example, I think it's very important. Would you deem this as pivotal in order to make effective the system of protection, the visa system, humanitarian protection, and all those legal instruments that are already available, but somehow are not easy to activate or access for those in need? I'm asking this to Giulia first, if she doesn't mind, and then America as well, if she wants to.
Yes, Sara, thank you for your question. Actually, I think that Italy is investing in training police forces, but I think is not enough, and maybe at the moment is not useful. Also connected to what American said before, we have in Italy a residence permit for people who are victim of trafficking and still abuse and endangered in Italy, that can access to this residence permit without any complaint to public authority. Just a social assistant can go to the police forces and say, this girl tell that she was trafficked and she is in danger. And just this complaint, that is not a formal criminal complaint, can be sufficient in some part of Italy to have a residence permit just for 1 year, and then he can be convertible in work residence permit. This kind of residence permit is can really open the road and the way to people that fear to present to the police or that have any problem of access to a residence permit. I mean that with this kind of residence permit, the criminal proceeding, everything arrive after a person is in a safe position. Then she will decide if she want denounce or if she don't want. In this case, the woman is, I think, free to decide what she wants to do, because the first things that the legal system wants to do is to protect her. This same strategic litigation is not implemented when we are in front of labor exploitation. In this case, a criminal denounce, a criminal complaint come first the residence permit. This is what we should not do. I mean, in this second case, people will fear to go to the police, even if we have a social worker that help this person. This social worker cannot protect these people, this person, to be put in a center for repatriation. Only residence permission can protect the people to be deported. Only regular and authorization to be legally in Italy can protect people. And then we can train police forces, but at first we need a strong legislation framework. So no one person should be deported because he has no a free and legally access to residence permit.
Giulia, may I add something to this? I mean, you know, this is again an interesting point, because we are in the area of reasonable grounds to believe that a person may be trafficked. Okay, you even have the Council of Europe Convention that has the recovery and reflection period for people who were trafficked for sexual labor, any kind of exploitation. You know, so the convention as such envisages that the process of identification is a process. It's not hardcore evidence for crime at the outset. You know, it is certain balance of probabilities that the person has been trafficked. And when we are at the stage, or has been not only trafficked, but even subjected to extremely exploitative working conditions. And, you know, there are other ways of going less extreme, but, you know, let's take it from what the law and then the directives say. So here, this is against the lens we are looking at, because can we access assistance and come forward when we are still at the stage of reasonable grounds to believe? Can we be granted that recovery, that reflection, that regularization in the territory? So be it, so that then we can move on to the next stage without having that fear of abuse of the system, where, you know, you would say criminals would channel the people towards this residence permits because it's going to be much easier, and in that way they will continue to exploit them for free in the country. Or we would have people who would abuse it and who would just say, yes, the threshold is too low and I'm going to have a residence here. Or this would penalize then the people who really would be in need of that protection. So, you know, but what I'm trying to say is that it's really your right to assistance if you have suffered human rights violations related to working conditions, be it in any sector. You know, the threshold should be that you should not depend on that filing of a criminal complaint or on that on that particular you know, fact that your residence is not documented or regularized in the country.
So, America, do you want to add something very quickly? Because I'm afraid I have to be the timekeeper here. So, unfortunately, we're about to close our webinar. But would you like to say something, to add something to the as an answer to my question?
Yeah, just briefly, I think that Giulia and Alexandra both make great points. And I agree that you have to have a strong framework. However, even to get to that framework, just thinking about the Dreamer movement in general, you know, from the DREAM Act to Daca to how it's really worked, it's been that partnership and coalition building. It's been extending, you know, talking to people who maybe are not immigrants' rights advocates. Maybe you have to go into the business sector. When we do some of the lobbying, when we did some of the lobbying for DACA, for the DREAM Act and other legislation, it's talking to those business sectors and letting them know this is how it's going to benefit you. You know, it's talking to the social services, you know, as a current in the process becoming a social worker, but the NASW is a position that we really need them to come out and defend DACA rights, immigration reform, because we need those social workers backing us. So I think that the coalition and partnership building from the ground and from the onset of it will ensure that after this framework is created, that you will also have the buy-in of those communities to continue the sustainability of those programs. So I think that having buy-in is really critical, but that would be all I can add there.
Well, thank you very much. That was very interesting. And thank you to all the speakers. Thank you for participating. You are an inspiration to all of us. And unfortunately, our time is up. I will salute you and I hope to see you soon in the future. And I hope that there's going to be a chance to work together again in the future, maybe in the context of the CCSDD new chapter on human trafficking. I am going to leave one last goodbye to Alexandra because I know that you guys are very close. So thank you again. It was a pleasure knowing you and hosting you in our seminar series.
Same for me, America, and same for me, Giulia. This was an immense pleasure, and we hope to be able to continue working for you in the future, in the near future, and also long-term future. Let's put it this way. I wish you all a wonderful evening. Thanks a lot again, and we will be in touch soon.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.